Hello, I'm Bud McCord. I'm here in Brazil, South America. Welcome to Food for Thought, Thinking with Jesus. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And we as believers can learn to think with Jesus. Our subject today is a crisis of faith, a crisis of faith. I want to read the devotional, and we'll think together. Then you can take these thoughts to Jesus. The just shall live by faith. Romans 1:17. A crisis of faith is caused when God seems to not be enough. As our crisis takes root in our inner life and begins producing fear, a sense of lack, and growing panic, we try to flee the crisis or manage the crisis in our own power. If you've ever experienced a crisis of faith, you know how it can bring out of you exactly what you had hoped would never appear again. For some, it brings on depression, which someone once described as anger without enthusiasm. For others, it brings on enthusiastic anger. Either way, we are moving in our own power since God seems to have let us down and we are running out of time. We must act since it appears that God will not act. Since faith is receiving freely from God, a crisis of faith is a crisis of diminished receiving. It is the opposite of what Paul described when he said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me in Philippians 4:13. A crisis of faith is the diminished receiving that happened to Peter when he took his eyes off of Jesus while walking on the water. He sank as soon as his eyes stopped receiving support from Jesus. It is a diminished receiving that happened to Moses when he stopped obeying God and struck the rock in the wilderness instead of speaking to the rock as God had commanded him. He lost his leadership position because he stopped receiving God's instruction and decided to invent his own plan. A crisis of faith is not an uncommon thing. If you read the scriptures from cover to cover, you will see many famous names mentioned, people like Adam and Eve, Enoch, Noah, Abraham and Sarah, Moses. You'll go right to the list of the famous people in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament with the apostles, and you will see that there is a continuous emphasis on crises of faith. Jesus won the battle when the crisis of faith was brought to him. You remember after Jesus' baptism, he was driven into the wilderness or taken into the wilderness by the Holy Spirit to be tempted. And you remember that the way that Satan came to Jesus when Jesus was extremely vulnerable because of not having eaten for 40 days and 40 nights, he comes to him and tries to give Jesus a new theology. The theology of the devil is not complex, it's not hard to understand, but it is subtle and it is dangerous. The theology of Satan is God is not enough. God keeps from us what we need to reach our full potential. Let me read it again because this is a very important thing to understand what the theology of Satan is so you can recognize it when you run into it. God is not enough. God keeps from us what we need to reach our full potential. If you go and read Matthew chapter 4 and read the temptation of Jesus, you will see that in the three different ways that Satan tries to tempt Jesus and create a crisis of faith is he says to Jesus that God is withholding bread, God is withholding a cure, and God is withholding Jesus being able to reach his full potential. The same crisis will run into you and will run into me. There will come a time when it will seem like God is not giving us resources for daily life. There'll be a time when we think that we need a cure or some solution and God just won't give it. And then finally, he'll give us an alternative lifestyle that will allow us to reach our full potential. Jesus won that battle. Then the angels of God came and comforted him, because it was always God's intention to comfort Jesus, but he needed to go through this test of faith. So we are always constantly in a theological arena, a battle in the invisible realm where there are two theologies. One theology is this, that we can receive from God because God is, and he is generous toward those who diligently seek him. That is the theology of our faith. We can be receptive before God because God is, and he is generous. That is what it is to have faith. It is receptivity before the generous heart of God. And the just shall live by faith. What does it mean to be just? For me, the best way that I understand to explain what it means to be just is to love the right person at the right time, in the right measure, and for the correct length of time, or with the right strategy. To be just is to love a person as they need to be loved, as they should be loved. The only way that I can be a person who is just is if I am receiving from the source of justice, which is the pure love of God, which was expressed through Jesus Christ. You will pass through a crisis of faith. When you do, you will find yourself being tempted. And that's why in the Lord's Prayer we are taught to pray, and do not let us fall into temptation, or free us from temptation. Because if we stop receiving well, we will stop loving well. It's the way it works. It is an ecosystem of spiritual life and love. We are to receive, rejoice, and release. That's living by faith. Have a great day. Think on these things with Jesus. You'll come to the right conclusion.